The help of Hashem, we are learning Chagiga Daf Chaf Aleph. We left off on Daf Chaf Amid Beis in the beginning of the third chapter. And the third chapter is called Chomer B'Kodesh. Chomer B'Kodesh means that the rabbis made 10 or 11 unique rabbinic stringencies, or the word ma'ala means a higher level. It's almost like a step. They put kachim in 10 or 11 areas on a higher step even than truma. So when we learned, let's say together in the Sugya Shabbos, Daf Yud Gimel, right, the Shmoina Asar Davar that was enacted in the attic of Hananya, in the attic of Hananya ben Garin. I'm missing one name over here, but the Shmoina Asar Davar, which was rules that they enacted to upgrade the standard of Truma, we're going to learn here in Chagiga 10 or 11 standards which makes Kachim on even a higher level than Truma. So we're going to learn through the Mishnah. We're going to explain each case at least a bit. A lot of it will have to remain open because the subsequent Gemara is going to go case by case by case and explain them. Just one of the many dinim that we're going to learn today, at least in the beginning, will touch upon the law of Chatzitza, of an interposition when something is taken to the mikvah. That you have to make sure that all of the body is exposed to the water, at least in potential, and certain items that are on the body or are on the utensil, they create a chatzitza, they interpose, they separate the waters of the mikvah or of the mayon from that item. So we're going to learn certain rabbinic stringencies connected to the laws of chatzitza. That will be at least the first case. We're going to learn towards the end of today's daf a very important rule when it comes to a mikvah, that even though if it's not a mayon, but if it's rainwater, aside of the fact that you cannot first put it in a utensil prior to it being inserted inside what we call the mikvah hole in the ground, but the mikvah water needs to have the minimum amount of 40 sa. If you have a gathering of water here, less than 40 sa, and on the side of it you have another mikvah that has the right amount, or even more than that, even if this hole has mayim she'uvim, has tap water, and on the side of this mikvah, or underneath the mikvah, there is a proper halachic mikvah, if you connect the waters one to the other, if you create hashaka, then the validity of one permeates the other. What do I mean by connecting the waters? So there has to be a hole with a minimum size known as kishifayferes hanoid. They used to put water or wine then in certain leather pouches, and there was a standard size spout or tube. Noid means, and that standard size tube, as we'll see in a moment, towards the end of this year, is a tube in which one can comfortably insert 2 fingers, which is the index finger and the middle finger in it, and turn their fingers around. I know that everyone has a little bit of a different size fingers, but that's as close as we find in the Tanoim, a precision of a shear. So if the hole is that size or larger, then we consider these 2 waters properly planting itself one in the other, touching each other, and the validity of one affects the other in a positive way. If the waters are touching through this opening, but it doesn't have that minimum size, then the water, the body of water that is not kosher, remains not kosher. This is very relevant because nowadays, because of the beautiful upgraded level of hygiene that we all have, the waters of a mikvah, let's say that a woman who's a nida, who biblically has to go to the mikvah, goes into, is not mayim she'uvim. It's really tap water. The reason why her immersion in that is 1,000% kosher is because even though the waters that you actually enter are not rainwaters, they're mayim she'uvim, but since on the side, and according to Lubavitch, the Rebbe Rashab, underneath it, I know here in Pico Robertson there is both, under and on the side, there is another real kosher mikvah in which women won't enter, because if women enter it again and again and again and again, it's going to get dirty. And cleaning out the water by taking it out, you can't do that because it's not so simple to get the water there halachically in a kosher way. So the solution is that you have on the side of the mikvah, real mikvah, and the body of water that you go into is koshered because of hashaka. There's something else called zriya, We're not going to get into all of these details right now, but we're going to be learning a little bit about this hashaka concept and about the size of shefeferes hadoid and many, many other dinim. We're going to go through the Mishnah, which will have, the way our version has it, 11 rules. So let's begin. Says the Mishnah. The rabbis added the following ma'alois, or chumres. These two words are going to be interchanged. Stringencies or higher standards. Maila means a standard or a higher standard, making kodesh even more susceptible to tuma than truma. Number one, shemadbilim kelim b'soich kelim letruma. If you want to make sure that utensils that will be used for truma is tahar and they're tamei, so the solution is, not always, but in most cases, take it to the mikvah. Can you put one utensil inside the other? Now let me add a very important nuance. If they are inserted one in the other tightly, then even for chulin it's not kosher. When we take our kalim to a mikvah for a complete different topic, which might be biblical, might be rabbinic, when the Torah writes in Parshas Matos the words v'toher, and there we went on war, and we took the utensils of goyim. So there is a halacha again, it might even be biblical, that a kalim that belonged to a goy that now went into the possession of a Jew have to be toivelt, which is why we do tfilas kalim and we make a bracha. So what if we take off the stickers? If you have one keli inside the other, like two cups, and they're tightly inserted, that's a biblical chatzitza. If the majority of the cup, if the majority of the keli is not directly in touch with the water. Rabbinically, even if it's just a minority of the keli, but it bothers you. But what happens if one utensil is inside the other and it's not tight, it's loose? The waters are able to touch the outer part of both utensils. That's a kosher mikvah. Even if you're taking it to the mikvah for the sake of truma, and that's something that we learned in the Mishnah and Daf Yud Ches Amud Beis, another rabbinic stringency. If I took it to the mikvah just for chulin, it's not even good for truma. But if I had in mind for truma, it doesn't bother me in the case where there is no chatzitza because it's loose, one and the other. Nevertheless, rabbinically, the Chachamim said that if one keli is inside the other, rabbinically it's not okay. Now, is it not okay because of, rabbinically, we are afraid that maybe there was a chatzitza, or maybe there is another issue that will lead to a big machlokes we'll have in the Gemara amongst the Amoraim. Guys, let's count. That's halacha number one. Okay, halacha number one is you cannot toivel a keli and a keli. Guys, when we go to the mikvah nowadays, tfilas kelim, we put one keli inside the other. It's not even for truma. You have to just make sure, that one doesn't adhere to the other. Halacha number two. Achoraim will interpret this word to mean gaboy, which is the back, the outer part, the toich and the inner part, and a part of the utensil that's called beis hatzivita. We'll leave for the Gemara the interpretation of this part of the keli. So guys, listen to this. If something has contact with a utensil, something that's tummy, it has halachic contact. So what happens? The whole keli becomes tummy. Yes. What happens if the source of tuma is only conveying tuma only on a rabbinic level? For example, I know we mentioned this in the last year, just to quickly mention it again, there are times that liquids, a liquid, not the saliva of a zav, but liquid that's tummy on the level of a sheni, midrabanan, not only becomes like a rishon, but midrabanan, any liquid that's tummy can be metame kelim. That's a rabbinic tuma. If it's only a rabbinic tuma, we say that only the part of the utensil that had direct contact with the source, with the rabbinic source of tuma, only that part becomes tamei. The other parts of the utensil remain tahor. So, but that's for chulin, that's for truma, but not for kodesh. For kachim, we don't make that differentiation. Even if the source is only midrabanan, if the keli is tamei in any one of its parts, all of it is tamei. Again, the outer part of the keli, the inner part of the keli, the tzvita part of the keli are considered three different kalim as far as truma is concerned. So if the source of truma touched the outside part, we'll say only the outside part is tummy on a level of a sheni, midrabanan. But if truma then entered the inner keli, we will say the truma is 100% good. Now, do we always separate the kalim into different parts? All of that will be clarified in the Gemara. That's only if every part of the utensil could function as a independent keli. So we have to learn a lot more about this din. Even on a rabbinic level, we don't always say this. But there are times that to the betterment, to the leniency of not furthering tuma, we could divide a keli into different parts by saying only that part became tummy, but never for kodesh. As far as kachim is concerned, we never will make the keli into anything other than one keli. And if the keli is tamei, all of it is tamei. If the source touched the outer part, kachim fell into the inner part. If the source touched the tzvita part and the kachim touched the outer part, it will become tamei. Halacha number 3. Hanoises hamidras, noises hatruma. Very important. A person is carrying truma in an earthenware utensil. That's very important. The advantage of using an earthenware utensil, a earthenware keli can never become tamei if the source touched the outer part of it. So if I have a barrel that's filled with truma wine, first of all, it's already good. It's not so easy for the truma to become tamei. Am I allowed to carry at the same time that I'm carrying a barrel of truma? Can I carry midras, for example, shoes of a zav, shoes of a nida? Now, guys, what's the worst case scenario? That the shoes will touch the barrel. Even if the shoes touches the outer part of the barrel, it's not going to make the barrel tamei at all, because earthenware never becomes tamei if the contact was only in the outer part. So even if I'm carrying truma, zikr if I'm carrying chulin, but even if I'm carrying truma, I could at the same time carry midras, as long as the truma is in an earthenware utensil. But the Chachamim rabbinically said, I may not carry kachim in an earthen keli, in a barrel, or any other ceramic, anything that's made out of earthenware. At the same time that I'm carrying kachim, I'm not allowed to carry that utensil. Even though that's a very big stringency, because the only way it would be able to convey tuma is not only if, since I'm carrying it together, one touched the other, is if the midras went inside the barrel. How would that happen? I mean, a person is mindful of it, but maybe that's going to happen. So we separate kachim from tuma even on that level. Halacha number 4. Big day oichlei truma, that garments of people that are mindful to stay away from tuma. They're not only eating chulin betara, these are people that are eating truma. So they are always mindful, I have to make sure that there's no tuma connected to truma, which is good. So they never had hesach hadas as far as truma is concerned. We learned this in Daf Yud Ches Amud Beis. The Chachamim said automatically is not considered guarded as far as kachim is concerned, and we go into the worst possibility. The worst possibility is that maybe this keli is tummy on the level of a midras, which means it's an av hatuma. Halacha number 5. Loi kimidas hakodesh midas hatruma. The word mida here means rule. They don't share the same rules, meaning, now this is clearly a halacha about chatzitza. So let me go into another scenario. Nowadays, we don't take clothing to the mikvah. Even though the clothing of a nida, in most cases, is midras, is tummy on the level of an av. Now when Mashiach is coming, we're going to take clothing to the mikvah. Same problem of chatzitza on the body, the same problem on utensils, the same challenge you have on garments. Now, what happens if you have two garments that are tied one to the other? They're tied together. If they are tied tightly, that's for sure a chatzitza. Tightly meaning that when you put it under the water is unable to touch all of the parts of the garments. What happens if they are only loosely tied? Many times people would go into a river and the river is running. You're going into a spring. The spring is running. That's a kosher mikvah. But, I want to in one go put all of my garments. So I would tie it together and I would stick it in there and I'm a chaya. The thing is that when garments become wetted, they swell a little bit. And even though now it doesn't look like they're very tight, maybe when you put them under the water, they're gonna inflate, and they will now create a chatzitza. That's a chumrah. Do you have to be concerned for that only for kachim, not for truma? So says the Mishnah, let's read it again. If I'm toiveling begadim for kachim, if they are tied together, even though it's loosely tied, that means that by biblical law there is no interposition, matir, I have to untie it. Another detail, not only do I have to untie it, but I have to first dry it. And then I'm matbel it. You know, the people today, when they wash for bread, first they make sure their hands are 1,000% dry. It's connected to these dinim. And then you want to tie them together for its transportation, then tie it together. But by truma, not only if the begadim are tied together, do you not have to untie it, you can lechatchila tie it together loosely. You can lechatchila koisher and then toivel it. And you don't have to be concerned whether it's dry or not. It can be wet. Now, wet, we said that rabbinically, if water becomes wet, it goes back to be a rishon. And if those waters are not washed off, then they can make midrabanan, they can make the keli into a sheni. So all of these stringencies are something that we are not concerned about if the only focus is truma. Halacha number 6. Kelim hanigmarim betara. Kelim, when you're making a utensil, not garments, also garments, a table, a pot, prior to it being a finished product, it's b'chlal not susceptible. From when were people mindful to make sure, it should not become tamei, when they were reaching near the point where they're finished? So kelim hanigmarim betara, as long as you were mindful from when it was getting finished, and now it's finished, and you know that nothing tamei touched it, do you have to toivel it now that it's ready? So, if it's for kachim, tzrichim tvila lakodesh. Avaloi letruma. For truma, and certainly for chulin, as long as you did not have hesech hadas, which is what we learned in last year, not from the beginning, from when it was getting near to it being completed. So when it became completed, you know nothing tummy touched it. You don't have to take it to the mikvah. For kachim, a brand new keli always has to be taken to the mikvah. I'm making just an association that's completely not related, just a concept. I know I mentioned it a few times because I had a good experience with that. That like when you buy a new pair of tefillin, it's brand, check it. You buy a new mezuzah, check it by someone else. It was just checked. Check it. That's the kind, you made a new keli, you know it never became tamei. If it's going to be used for kachim, it's a new keli, take it to the mikveh right away. Halacha number 7. Hakeli mitzaref masha b'toicha l'kodesh. I have a keli. I have a large plate. On the plate, I have 5 pieces of meat. Let me ask you a question. What happens if a source of tuma touches a piece of meat? Contact. Okay, so let's say that the source of tuma is a shlishi. It touches a piece of meat. Kachim. So you can argue that meat became a revi, and the other pieces of meat in the same utensil, even if they're touching, but they're different cuts, they're different pieces, will not become tamei, because by kachim, the end of the line is a revi. By kachim, we say that since they are all in the same keli, they are considered one item of food. So if a source of tuma touches any one of them, it's as if all of them had direct contact with the source. The keli is mitzaref, masha b'toichai, only for kachim. Avaloi letruma. That means, I like the mamish this example, that if you have truma items in a plate, even if they are touching each other, doesn't matter. They're separate pieces of food. So the ones that are not yet shlishi, listen, if the source is an av, then it's going to make the first piece into a rishon. Then the next piece will be a sheni. The next piece will be a shlishi, but that's it. Every piece, even though they become tamei, they go down a notch. We don't say that since they are in the same keli, they're considered all connected. You should know that this is a big topic. Every topic is a big topic. Just to make an association. We mentioned a few times about the separation of challah. The chiyuv of separating challah, today it's rabbinic, is for when you make the dough. Ideally, prior to you baking. What happens if a person baked and they forgot to separate challah? So the halacha is, take all of the bread, challah, matzah, that was made from that batch, put it in a keli, and separate challah. When you make matzah nowadays, they do that lechatchila because they don't want to waste a second. They want to have the 18 minutes from the mixing of the flour and the water until when the product is final. So they make the dough, they make the matzah, they take everything out from that batch, and then they do afrashas challah. It has to be in the same keli. Do they have to touch each other? That's really connected to this topic. If keli is mitzarefit, then they're all connected. Let's go weiter. Halacha number 8. Haravi bar kodesh pasul v'ashlishi batruma. The end of the line by truma is only a shlishi. Kachim is more chomer, like we are saying. Kachim can become tummy even on the level of a revi. Halacha number 9, or maila number 9, chumra number 9. That batruma im nitmeis achas miyadav. If one of one's hands become tamei, tum of hands is to begin with midrabanan. Midoiraisa, either you entirely are tar or you are tamei. Number 2, midoiraisa, a person can never become a sheni. Midrabanan, like we learned in the beginning that there are 3 reasons why one's hands will become tamei. Either hesach hadas, or even if you were not masiach das, if I touch a rishon. Biblically, a rishon cannot make a person into a sheni. Rabbinically, they make my hands. Now, if I touch the rishon only with one hand, even for truma, only that hand became tamei. Only that hand has to be washed. But when it comes to kachim uba kodesh, if one hand became tamei, the other one became tamei. Matbol shteyem. Why? Third to last line in the amid, because shehayad mitamei es chaverta ba kodesh avoloi batruma. Maila number 10. Oichlim oicholim neguvim. One is allowed to eat foods that never became wet from when they were disconnected from the ground, even though your hands are tamei biyodayim mesoyavois, as long as the food is either chulin or even truma, because when it comes to food, prior to it becoming wet, with the knowledge and contentment of its owner, after it being disconnected from the ground, that food is not even mukhshir lekabel tuma. And becoming wet, by the way, doesn't only mean with water. So you have the mnemonic, the simon of yat shachadam. So if it became wet with water, or with dew, or wine, or oil, or blood, or milk, or bees honey, even though now it's dry, since it became wet once, it's mukhshar. It's now susceptible to becoming tummy. If we know it never got wet, it cannot become tummy. So even if the food is truma, and the person eating it, his hands or her hands are sheni, we know it's yudayim misoy avois. That's another word for tuma. Doesn't matter, you can eat the truma because the food never became mukhshar. But avoloi b'kodesh, if you have kachim food, never became wet, doesn't need to become mukhshar. If any source of tumah touches it, it will become tamei. And daf chaf aleph, we're getting into today's daf, halacha number 11, at least the way our Mishnah has it into 11, we'll see again that others consider 2 to be the same, so there's only 10, but here we're going with number 11, that a person who's an oinen. Now, an oinen is someone who is in the highest state of mourning for losing one of one's 7 halachic closest relatives. Normally the oinen himself or herself will do the mitzvah of taking part of the burial, and they'll become tamei b'tumas meis. If that will be the case, we're not discussing that. There are times that a person doesn't have any tumas meis. Practical example, you're living in a different country, can't make it for the burial. So there's no tumas meis, but the person is in a state of aninus. What happens when they leave the state of aninus? Do they have to go to the mikvah? No, if they're not tamei, they're not tamei. For kodesh, Chazal made a takana. If you were an oinen, now that you left that state with all of the details, burial, If the burial happened on the day of the passing, maybe you're still an oinen at night, rabbinically, but whenever aninus is gone, the oinen, or another example, there are 4 people that not have to bring karbanos after they get out of their tumah. Let's go into a woman who gives birth. And by the way, all of our wives, when Mashiach will come, will have to bring all these karbanos, which they were unable to bring until now, because we don't yet have a Beis HaMikdash. So on the 41st day after the birth of a boy, on the 81st day after the birth of a girl, you completely left all of the dinim connected to Tumah and Tara, to childbirth. You had the week or 2 weeks of Tumah. You had biblically the other totaling 40 days by a boy, totaling 80 days by a girl. Now you're good, you're back to your normal cycle, but on the next day you have to bring karbanos. The woman, and before bringing karbanos, these people cannot eat kachim. Person is a mitzvah, they have to bring karbanos at the end of the purification process. A man is a zav who saw 3 re'iyas. He has to count 7 clean days. He's after all that. On the 8th day, he has to bring karbanos. So it's interesting that midirabanan, after they brought karbanos, for them to eat kachim, they got to go to the mikvah again. These are the 2 dinim. The oinen, who left the aninus. Now, if an oinen became tummy b'tumas meis, then it's irrelevant. They have to go to the mikvah to get rid of their corpse tumah. But in the case where there's no corpse tumah, they simply went away from that period of mourning. And umechusar kippurim, after they brought their karbanos, Midirabanan, prior to you eating kachim, you have to go to a mikvah. Tzarichem tefillah lakodesh. However, for anything that's not as holy as kodesh, even for truma, there is no such a rabbinic law. Avoloi truma. So these are the 11 milas or chumras that kachim has beyond truma. Hanania ben Chizkiah ben Gorin. Just going back to the Shemona Asar Davar. Okay, second line from the top. Says the Gemara, let's go into the first case. Again, like we mentioned, even now when I go Tfilas Kalim nowadays, if 2 Kalim are stuck one in the other, that's a Chatzitza. The majority of the Kali stuck, Roiv u'makpid, Chatzitza midoiraisa. Either Roiv or Makpid, Chatzitza midorabanan. The case of the Mishnah is you have 2 Kalim, one inside the other, but they're loose. So the Gemara wants to know about Kodesh Mai Tamaloi. Since, listen, if they're stuck to each other, then even for Truma it's Chatzitza, even for Chulin it's Chatzitza. It's not stuck. So why did they make that takana? Answer number 1, answer number 2. Rav Ila, Rava. Amar Rav Ila, there's a possibility that maybe the inner keli is going to weigh down inside the outer keli, maybe, and it's going to create a chatzitz. It's highly unlikely, but because of that possibility, for kodesh they made a takana, even though you saw it didn't weigh down. I mean, that's the rabbinic law. Loi plug, you can't do one inside the other. In other words, the Rabbi Ila understands the reason for the din number 1 in the Mishnah is because of there might be a chatzitz. Problem is that we just learned all of the 11. The halacha number 5 in the Mishnah, that if you have 2 garments that are tied loosely to each other, for kachim you have to untie it and dry it. Because maybe under the water it's going to swell up and it's going to become tight one and the other, and you're going to have a chatzitza. So the Mishnah already gave you a case where we have to be concerned for chatzitza by kodesh more than truma. Why would we have to have 2 cases? Does that not imply that the din of the Reisha has nothing to do with chatzitza? As it says in the Sefer, that the rule of kachim is not like the rule of truma. It's more serious. By kodesh, 2 kalim, 2 garments are tied to each other loosely. You got to untie it, matter it, and you have to dry it, and only then can you be matbal it. And then, if you want to, you can tie it together. By truma, not only do you not need to untie it, you can lechatchila tie it, koisher, and then you can toivel it. So it doesn't that imply that the Reisha's rule is not chatzitza related? Answers the Gemara, no. Says Rabbi Ila, Reisha, rule number 1, Seifa, rule number 5 are both connected to the law of chatzitz. The reason why the Chachamim needed to specify both of these, because each one has a novelty over the other. Because the Ashmin, and only the case of the Reisha, I would have thought that Hainu Tamad de la Kodesh Loi, why is it that they were so machmer? You can never toivel a keli inside the other. Makes sense, like we just said, because at times the inner keli will weigh down. Mishum kaveidoi shel keli the ikam. But when it comes to the seifam, the leka kaveidoi shel keli, there's no weighing down. They're tied loosely. Maybe they never would have enacted such a gezerah. So they needed to clarify. We are concerned about it. Second to last line in the Amid. Same thing in reverse. If the Mishnah only would have taught the Maila that the Chachamim made in case number 5, V'yashmin and Seifa, Havamina, Hainu, Taima, de la Kodesh Loi, Mishum, Tav Chafalef, Amid Beis, that the Kitra, B'maya, Ahadu Kemihadek, they are tied together. When you put a knot inside water, like we mentioned, it becomes tight. Because that's the nature. It absorbs water, it becomes fatter, it becomes larger, and now it might become tight. But by the Reisha, you know what water does naturally? Water has a floating effect on things that are in it. When you put something into water, it's not going to weigh down in the water, it's going to actually float up in the water. Avol Reisha, the Maya akfuye makfulomana, it makes Kalim float. So it's even farther away from the realm of possibility that the inner keli will weigh down so tightly that it's going to create a chatzitza, loyav a chatzitza, and that's why tzricha. And now the Gemara says, now that we have this approach of Rav Ila, that the reason for case number 1 is related to chatzitza, Rav Ila now will be consistent with another statement that he made. Rav Ila l'taimei, to Amar Rav Ila, Amar Rav Chanina bar Papa. Even though when we went through the Mishnah, we counted 11 laws. When he made a recap, he said, Eser Mailu Shanukan. There are 10 scenarios where the Chachamim had this higher standard by Kachim over even Truma. Now, before we go on to the statement, how did he have 10 when the Mishnah gave 11? But that's the answer. Even though Chazal needed to speak out case 1 and case 5, at the end of the day, they're both about Chatzitza. So that's why we are able to summarize the Mishnah by saying, there's only 10. But now we added another nuance, and that's connected to the beginning of last shir, when we spoke about people who make a hachlata that they're going to treat their chulin as if it's kachim. So says, now all of these chumras that we learned now in our third Pedic, there are 10, 11 chumras by kachim. Are they only for kachim, or are they also for chulin shenasu al taras hakodesh? So he said, this is Rabbi Ila in the name of Chanin ben Papa, the first 5 cases of the Mishnah, bein la kodesh, bein la chulin shenasu taras hakodesh, is both for kachim, and even chulin that are not really kodesh, but if you chose to behave with your chulin, to treat your chulin as if you're eating kachim, then these enactments are effective for them as well. But achroinois, the latter cases of the Mishnah, are only dinim connected to kodesh and not connected to chulin shenasu al taras hakodesh. And the proof that Rabbi Ila l'taime is the number 10. But now let's focus on the statement. And what difference will there be on the first 5 and the other 6? So answers the Gemara, my tame, chomesh kamaisa, the first 5 dinim of the Mishnah, even though they are all rabbinic laws, but the is lohu derara de tuma midoiraisa. There is a connection to biblical tuma. Like, for example, chatzitza. Chatzitza is a biblical concern. I know that biblically, if 2 utensils are inside the other loosely, biblically it's not a problem, but this concern that it might become a chatzitza, something might happen that will make it problematic, midoiraisa. And Rashi goes through all of the cases in the Reisha, every topic. We're not creating a rabbinic tumah. There's a biblical concepts that we're saying that maybe it will have a connection to a rabbinic tumah, to a biblical tumah.
Is that the same problem? Is that the same problem with tying knots, that they potentially can?
Very good. Tying knots is connected. It's called drara the tumah midoiraisa. So since you might touch upon a biblical tumah, that's why when the Chachamim made a gzeira, they didn't only do it to kachim, but they also did it to chulin shel nasu al taras hakodesh. But basrai, so all of the latter cases of the Mishnah, It's never connected to a biblical concern. The leis lo derara de tuma midoiraisa. So therefore, even though Chazal were machmir, gazru b'hu rabbanon only la kodesh, but la chulin shenasu al taras ha kodesh le gazru b'rabbanon. Like just for example, like when we're saying that your hands, when you eat kachim, even if the kachim never got wet, right? My friends, hands are only, the sheni on hands is only a rabbinic. There is no sheni on hands b'chlal. I'm giving you an example. In all of the latter cases of the Mishnah, it's all like a rabbinic on top of a rabbinic. The whole concern is only rabbinic. And then on top of that, they made a gzeira that's very far-fetched. That's only for kodesh directly. Atkan, let's go back to the Atkan is Rab Ila's interpretation that the reason why for kachim you cannot toivel one keli inside the other is because it might interpose. Rava Omar, no, he disagrees with that. Mida Seifa, since the fifth case of the Mishnah, the untying of begadim is connected to chatzitza, Reisha, Lav, Mishum chatzitz. The Reisha Haine Taima, the reason why Chazal made a takana that you may not toivel a keli inside a keli for kachim, third to last line, Gezeira shalayatbel mechatem v'tzinoiros bikli she'ein befit kishifei feres hanoid. A needle, a spinning fork, small utensils, which practically people were concerned when they took them to the mikvah, that they will get lost. One practical solution, put the needles inside a jug. So when you toivel the jug, you're going to have the needle is already in there. Much less likely that it's going to come out. Now hold on. Think about it for a second. The keli has to go into a mikvah. The jug that I'm putting into the mikvah, I get the jug is going into the mikvah, but will the needle, will the spinning fork, or other small utensils that we use today, are they in the mikvah, or are they in the jug that's in the mikvah? They are in the jug that's in the mikvah. Why would that b'chlal be good? They're not directly in the mikvah. So the answer will be, like we spoke on in the intro, that as long as the outer keli's opening, mouth, has this size, which was the standard spout that people put in their drinking pouches, Shefeiferes hanoid. If it has that amount of opening, then the waters that are inside the jug, that are inside the bottle, are considered connected to the outer mikvah, and they are considered mikvah waters. Hashaka happened. But here is the gezeira. You might end up toiveling a keli whose opening doesn't have this shiur of kishofeferes hanoid. Now, all of the other utensils that are inside the outer one are not in the mikvah. The waters in that utensil is bona fide mayim she'uvim. It's not mikvah. Even though I am toiveling it in a keli like this, and I see the opening is bigger than shifei feres hanoid, for kachim, chachamim made this takana, never do it. Let's read it inside. Kidetnan, like we learned the Mishnah mikvahs. That Eruv mikvahs, if you want to mingle mikvahs through the means known as hashaka, the example is that we gave in the intro that nowadays, men and women, the water that we go into in the mikvah, that's not kosher mikvah waters. That was cleaned out, hopefully last night. They cleaned the tiles in the mikvah, and they opened up tap water. Nothing here is kosher. But I'm mingling it with another mikvah that no one entered, so it stays clean for years. That's on the side of it. Ideally, the Rebbe Rashab says underneath it. But how are they halachically touching? Guys, if they're going to touch too much, then the waters will mingle so much, then the dirt of this one will go into that one. So you make the minimum size opening, as we all know. We go to the mikvah, look, and you'll see that both on the floor and on the wall there are holes. So it says the Mishnah that in order for the mikvahs to be considered mingled, the opening has to be in the size of the standard shifei feres hanoid, the tube or the spout that was in the skin bottles that was commonly used in those days. Another nuance about that size, it has to be as large, not only as the hole, but as the thickness of the hole, which means it has to be as large as the outer circumference. Not the inner circumference, the outer circumference. Daf Chav Beis. And what is that? I don't know the size of their standard spouts or tubes. So the Mishnah at least is helping us out by saying it's an opening, a circle in the size that you are able not only to with difficulty stick in two fingers. These fingers, normally when Chazal speak about fingers, we're speaking about the thumb width, the shalosh boys that we learned about. But here we're speaking about the index, and the middle finger, you should be able to stick both of them and turn your fingers around. That's just a standard aperture or circumference of the inner part of the hole. Oh. So again, so now you get the takana. We are afraid that if the outer keli has a very tight opening, then the kelim that are in there are not even good for chulin. That's a biblical issue. Again, the first cases of the Mishnah is connected, like we just learned, to a drara, the tuma midairaisa. But here, I'm toiveling it in a keli that has a large opening, this size or larger. The Chachamim made a takana. For kachim, it's not good. Savar Rava, Kahada Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Rava Baravua, not like we quoted Rab Ila, Amar Rab Chanina ben Papa, that when he finished learning the Mishnah, he says, in the Mishnah we have 10 stringencies. No. If the first case is not connected to Chatzitza, it's a whole new takana. He concluded by counting the numbers the way we would, but he did it a lot deeper than we did it. In other words, he knew the reasons behind all of the chumras, and every one is connected to another halacha. Yud Aleph Ma'ila Shanukan, that our Mishnah is addressing 11 different stringencies. And he agrees with Rab Chanina bar Papa that only the first six are connected even to Chulin Shanasu al Taras HaKodesh. Sheisha Reshaynois are Bein LaKodesh, Bein LaChulin Shanasu al Taras HaKodesh. As we had at the end of the second chapter, we are following the Tanoim that hold that Chulin Shanasu al Taras HaKodesh is Kodesh. But Achroinois only LaKodesh, Avalei LaChulin Shanasu al Taras HaKodesh. And like we learned before in Mai Ika, and why? Because the latter are rabbinics on top of rabbinics. There's no derara, the tuma midorais. Now, is there a practical difference between the understanding of Rav Ila and the understanding of Rava in the first case of the Mishnah? Ma'ika bein the Rava bein the Rav Ila? Yes, there is a practical difference. And the practical difference will be if the outer keli is either a basket, a sal, or it's a gargusni. A gargusni is some sort of standard large strainer that was always used in the process of making wine. When the wine would come out of the press, before it would go into the lower vat, it would go through the strainer. These are kalim that never have a small opening. They only always have a very large opening. What happens if you fill these kalim up with other kalim and you took them to the mikveh? Lakoidish, says the Gemara, Laman the Omar, that it's related to chatzitz according to Elah. I don't care how large the opening is. I don't care if the outer keli never has a small opening. The problem is that maybe the inner keli will become very heavy, and somehow the waters won't go to all of the parts of both kelim, and you got a chatzitz. But Laman Amar, according to Rava, that the only reason of the first rule in the Mishnah, the first maila, mishum gezeira shamayatbel mechatem etzinoid, is in a keli she'ein befiv kishefeiferes hanoid. So then we're going to say that in the scenario where never is such a keli that little, sal and a gargusni she'ein b'fiyim kishefeiferes hanoid, there is no reason ever to be machmer. Even with all of these milas, it's going to be okay even for kachim. Let's hop another few lines over here because we have time. For and this now will be consistent with something else that Rava said. To Amar Rava, sal v'gargusnei, again this type of basket, this large strainer, that shemilan bekalem, that you fill them up with other utensils, vihit bilan. Now Rava did not differentiate for what, which means by inference, even if you are taking these items to the mikvah, for them to be used with kachim, says Rava Tohoiden. And he adds, now these two utensils, both a basket, is very porous. The gargusni is a strainer, very porous. So let me ask you a question. What happens, right? Hatoivel sham lo yasa lo tefillah. What's going to happen if the sal and the gargusni? I'll just give you an example. You have two mikvahs, one on the side of the other, one on the side of the other. Both of them together have 40 saw, but you have this basket that's separating the sides. So the openings in the walls of these utensils, even though they are many, And if you were to add one with the other, you have a lot more than the Keshefeferes Hanoid, but you don't have one single hole that has that size. And what we are learning right now is that in order for you to be able to mingle one mikvah with the other, one opening itself has to have that size. One is enough. But if you have hundreds of them, but none of them have that size, then you can't mingle one mikvah with the other. So mikvah shechilkoi b'sal v'gargusni, if you separate two mikvahs, and now each half has less than 40 saw, you toivel on either side, lo also loy tefillah. And the example that we'll bring now, think about this. Again, we have tiles in our mikvahs. It's hard to relate. But then what tiles? Everything was made out of earth. What happens again if you have a large mikvah, but there is a wall of earth that's separating both sides? And it's very porous. It's not compacted. And we know that waters from one side are traveling through the wall to the other side. Throughout the whole wall. It's also not going to be good. Even though that if you were to add every hole together, you would have this shear of 2 fingers that you can turn around, plus, I don't care, that's not good enough. It's not all together. And that's his raya. The ha'ara kula, earth, the whole earth, not compacted earth, stam earth, is chalchule mechalchala. It's very porous. And nevertheless, if you have, that's the way the Tosfos Rid explains the Gemara, uba'inan de'ika mem sa b'makim echad, every hole itself has to have 40 saw or more, but if you don't have it all together, and if the mechitza is very porous, we don't say waters are seeping from one side to the other so they are connected. They're not connected. This is all just confirming the din of you have to have this Shefeferes Hanoid. We'll stop over here. God willing, a lot more to be continued.